And now we enter Roman numeral 9 with Jim Crow. Okay, well, again, this is one of those things that it's history, so you don't want to ignore it because those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And I mean the actual history, not the class. But this is one of those periods of time that we're really not that proud about. But Jim Crow laws were a series of laws designed to discriminate against African Americans, but in much more subtle and interesting ways. The name Jim Crow comes from the character in minstrel shows named Jumpin' Jim Crow. Jumpin' Jim Crow was one of the prototypical minstrel show characters. Again, it was a white actor in blackface, rags, and a beat-up hat who would jump around and act like an idiot and easily get tricked by white people who were much, much smarter than him. The term then evolved to be any African American. Any African American could be called Jim Crow as an insult. So the Jim Crow laws were laws that were designed to take advantage of the African Americans. So they're basically replacements for the black codes. But the difference between the Jim Crow laws and the black codes is that the Jim Crow laws are much more subtle. Just as the white characters outsmart Jim Crow the character, the Jim Crow laws are designed to outsmart the African Americans rather than just beating them into submission. Take, for example, voting. A lot of the Jim Crow laws revolved around voting and so forth. One of the oldest examples of this would be the poll tax. A poll tax is what it sounds like. It is a fee that you have to pay in order to vote. Usually, again, a couple dollars or something like that. The catch here is, first of all, African Americans didn't have a lot of money, so spending it on voting is probably not something that they're all really interested in doing. But even if they had money, what they discovered was that the amount the poll tax was oftentimes changed based on your race. Imagine that. So white people had to pay less of a poll tax than African Americans. Weird. But let's say an African American decides to pay the poll tax and so forth and wants to go up to vote. He then has to pass the literacy test. The literacy test is, again, what it sounds like. You had to pass a test that proved that you could read and write before you could vote. Now, the thing about the literacy test is, first of all, again, literacy among African Americans was very low, but the actual thing you had to read was basically a threat. It was a written threat. So, if you were smart enough to pass the literacy test, you were also smart enough to know that you were basically taking your life into your hands by deciding to vote. And so it wouldn't surprise you that a lot of them said, you know what, it's not worth it. I don't want to vote anymore. Now, I know what you may be asking yourself, but what about all those poor, illiterate white people? What about them? Weren't they affected by these laws? That's where the grandfather clause kicks in. The grandfather clause says that if your grandfather could vote, you can vote, regardless of the poll tax and the literacy test. So that means all the uneducated hillbillies out there who don't have the money to vote can still vote because of the grandfather clause. Meanwhile, African Americans, all their grandparents would have been slaves, can't vote, therefore they're not protected. So these laws, because of the complicated nature of them, were trickier and therefore were never really caught by the North. Because again, they're violations of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but the North never really bothered to go after them because, again, it wasn't that cut and dried. It wasn't like the black codes, which just flat out said blacks can't vote, which again was nakedly unconstitutional. These, because they were more complicated, required more effort, and so for a lot of whites in the North, they just said, you know what, not worth it, just let them deal with it. Now, again, you might think that these are, again, horribly, horribly unconstitutional, and someone did sue over them. In 1896, you have the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, it dealt with segregation on railroad cars. There were separate black railroad cars and white railroad cars, or colored cars as they were called at the time. Plessy sued on the grounds that, this is unconstitutional. What the Supreme Court said in one of its weirder moments, the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson says that segregation is fine as long as it is separate but equal. So as long as it is separate but equal. This was basically a blank check for the South to run away with racism. What they began doing from that point on is making everything separate but equal, because they're going, separate we can do. So this is why if you see pictures of like the early 1900s in the South, you'll see pictures for things like the colored waiting room, the colored water fountain, the colored bathroom. Because again, what they did is they separated all the facilities. The catch was the but equal part was not really being carried out. So there were separate black and white schools, but the black schools were much, much worse than the white schools. The colored dining room is much, much worse than the white dining room, etc. Because in order to challenge it, you would have to file a lawsuit, which means you need a lawyer, which means it would take a large amount of money, and it would also take a lot amount of time. And so again, they basically used this to grind the African Americans into the dirt, over time. Because again, you can't sue over everything, and eventually the North just gives up with it. So they were using separate but equal in the Jim Crow laws to essentially, again, grind them out without having to, again, be so forceful as you were with the black coats and so forth. As for, again, segregation as a whole, not only do you have these laws and things which are called de jure segregation, but you also have de facto segregation. De facto segregation is segregation of fact, or segregation by fact. It's segregation that just happens. De facto segregation was much more common in the North, where they didn't have, again, the laws. I feel like we talked about this earlier. One second. Did we talk about de facto segregation in an earlier part of this outline? No? Okay, my fault. De facto, I thought we talked about it already with the immigration, but in any case, de facto segregation is segregation of fact. It's segregation that just happens. So people having to live with, who just happen to live around people of the same race and so forth. This, again, was very popular in the North because they didn't have a lot of laws about segregation. It's what happened that way. So like your neighborhood might be entirely white, not because there are any laws stopping other races from living here, but just because you live near all white people. That was, again, sort of the pattern that had developed during that period of time, and again, very popular in the North. If you chose to break de facto segregation and live somewhere that you weren't supposed to, that's where lynching comes into play. Lynching was a very popular way of dealing with African Americans who broke the rule. Lynching, if you're not familiar with the term, is hanging. But again, the difference between hanging and lynching usually is the brutal and public nature of it. Again, the difference between lynching and hanging is basically the brutal and public nature of it. When you hang someone, it's just to kill them. When you lynch someone, it's to kill them in a painful way, in a public way, so that other people will know about it as well. So like in the South, they would hang or lynch African Americans and then set fire to them to serve as an example to other African Americans of what not to do. It's estimated that like at its peak, you're dealing with about 200 lynchings a year, which is pretty bad. And this, again, is everything from the KKK to just local people. The NAA reactions to these rules and things like that, you had people like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells starts the American Anti-Lynching Society, in which Ida B. Wells argues for rights for African Americans and trying to put more laws in place to stop things like lynchings and so forth. You also have the appearance of the NAACP. The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This was an early organization created by, among other people, W.E.B. Du Bois. The NAACP is a legal organization that works on behalf of African Americans, helps them to file lawsuits and so forth, helping them to maintain their rights, to keep their rights and so forth, challenging the racist laws and so forth. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's everything you need under Jim Crow. And now finally we get into Roman numeral 10, which is the woman question.